So far, when looking at articles and writings and perspectives on East Asian ceramics, we have seen it from a very analytical um, perspective for most cases, also opinions and that kind of thing as well. But this article actually takes all of that to another level as it starts as we are almost the people there in that first person perspective as someone in the marketplace, in particular Momoyama, Japan. So this is shopping for pots in Momoyama, Japan. The author of this article is Louise Cort. She is the curator at two galleries, one of which Smithsonian Institution, which is why she was part of receiving the Distinguished Scholar Award from the Smithsonian. She also in 2012 won a prize for Japanese ceramics, her Japanese ceramics research. So obviously she's seen as knowledgeable in this field. She is around a lot of artistic pieces as a curator. And yes, that's very good to know as we analyze and look through this article. So the main statement from Louise is that on page 83, the international marketplace of Momoyama, Japan created eager shoppers who in turn helped to create a new panoply of Japanese ceramics. So there's a heavy focus in this article on international trade and the role of trade. And a part of that has to do with this marketplace. So this kind of brings us into where she's going to be going with this article, which we look at, first of all, the format. Again, at the beginning, this viewpoint of the market is a really interesting way to start the article and almost feels like a book or a novel in that sense. And as she goes from there, she looks at what are some available ceramics, where are these ceramics from, where are they sold, who sold them and who bought them, how much do they cost, and the use for these ceramics that were bought and sold. So she goes through these things in a lot of different ways. She gets her information from her methodology and evidence. Her methodology is mostly literature analysis, mix of primary and secondary sources, of course. Her first one, a letter from 1588, of a tea master talking about exchanging these products and the cost. So that's where she gets some of those numbers from. How much do these things cost? And then another is a document referring to terminology and marketing. And this is a primary source as well. And then there's a Kakumeki diary, which is talking about three particular merchants and their specialties and what kind of that looked like to be in that business, and how that influenced what things they sold or bought, or that kind of thing as well. And this was a secondary source because she was looking at someone else's analysis on this diary, not looking directly at the diary herself. Then there's also a visual analysis, of course, in this article, many photos. She looks at kilns and specialties, and the example I provided was the shinoware, the pictorial decoration on the Japanese ceramics. So how this shinoware and how it was portrayed on these ceramics, thinking about what it looks like, seeing a lot of pictures and that kind of thing as well. Evidence, overarching, looking at current archaeological investigation. So she backs up most of her arguments with this archaeological evidence, as seen in physical, tangible things, as well as words through the documents that we kind of mentioned earlier. And then looking at these sites, of course, and using the actual pieces and the documentation. And she also uses related research, of course, as well, which she provides to try to help back up her arguments made in this article. So a lot of this article focuses on tea culture and Chenoyu, this idea of tea culture. So some of the pictures I was very interested in bringing about were tea bowls. So this first one, stoneware with black glaze, very interesting. You can almost see like little speckles on the outside of this. It also looks very rough. If you look on the left, way on the side, you can see some bumps that it just looks like a very rough texture. And I wonder, what's it like to hold that? Probably very, very interesting to be drinking out of something, not only with that rough texture, but also with an uneven lip, as you can see on the right side. It's not even all the way across. Some authors might say this has to do with wabi, the idea of wabi, and might even be romanticized in that way. A very interesting way to participate in tea culture would be to not have the perfectly even products without bumps, without blemish. And I would argue those probably aren't even blemishes. Those are just personality. Maybe the potters themselves added those things. Maybe it was part of the firing process on accident. But either way, it produced a very interesting environment and drinking. So also the foot, looking at that, obviously not a main focus from what I can see of the piece. It doesn't bring, as you can see on the right side, the tea bowl elevates very much, because that foot really seems to be the same as the bottom of the body of the tea bowl. So yes, black glaze, no cavetto, no curvature, really straight up and down the walls, vertically parallel. It's very shiny as well. So some terminology, important. Chenoyu mentioned before, tea culture, and that was a great focus of this article. Nochigama, the tea of tea caddies, keeping that tea in a container. Karamonoya, which is also related to karaimono, mentioned as well. Idea of Chinese goods, kind of grouping that all together, whether or not it should be. That's how the term has been constructed. Kyoyaki, glazed stoneware. Some other Luzon, which has to do with Spanish Philippines trade. These were storage jars for tea. Mishima, which is the Korean stoneware bowls, a specific kind with white slip over the dark body. Yes, and Namban, utilitarian stoneware, is probably not something maybe that would be in a court as a decoration, but maybe something more practical or useful, something maybe even that would relate to wabi in some ways, but that's Namban. And then Imayaki, new ceramics. So here is the second. I like this one as well because it just shows what particular ideas the potters might have had in mind. For this one, the Bridge of the Gods was the focus of this. There wasn't other decoration, and it's just that painted on bridge with maybe a bluish, perhaps even green in some senses, just a bridge on there. So it meant something obviously to the potter to have that on there and have that as the design. This one also has some roughness to the texture of the outside. What does it feel like? Probably different from the other one because those holes are almost inverted rather than poking out, going outward like the other one. The lip is also uneven on this one. And the foot, of course, you can see heightens or elevates the whole bowl a little bit more. The separation is much different. And you can see kind of by looking at the foot on the bottom picture that maybe they were holding on to it when they dipped it in, and you can see it didn't necessarily cover that whole base, but I think it looks very, very, it gives it just a wonderful personality. I like to think of this white glaze as almost like a pearly kind of white because it looks like a pearl from a clamshell in a lot of senses, not so pure white like some other pieces, thinking of the blue and white porcelain, not quite as white as some of those, but it's very interesting. And no cavetto in this one as well. So as we look at the author's argument evidence, this is where the bulk of the paper really comes out, because you see she's proposing there's an international age taking place, and this is what leads to the Chenoyu in Japanese ceramics development. So she's really making a statement that the the diverse range of trade taking place from all over the world, not just China, Korea, nearby countries, but places in Europe, and Africa, even in Asia as well, and how that has developed the tea culture and the ceramics in Japan. She also talks about trade network as being a source of silver and gold. She's talking about the diversity of the goods that are in these markets now in this time, because it's coming from all over the world, global market, international, as she says. And then the wealth of trade, she's saying, is one of the things that's really causing the Chanoyu activity and ceramics products to be developed, to take place. And then she uses this word temptation, and she uses foreign. So this temptation to foreign goods is really what she thinks is the leading factor to create the Chanoyu in its mature form, which is, of course, very subjective in a lot of senses, but she's using that. And she's also saying it's resulting in Momoyama ceramics emerging. So the idea of temptation and the idea of it being a foreign other kind of idea is very particular to this article. Now, of course, thinking about that, I'm very hopeful about this idea that she's saying, well, we're in this time, in this way of thinking about things, we're shifting away from the aesthetic feel and kind of focusing a little bit more on commerce and why people were trading how they were, and it wasn't just about aesthetics. So that's a good thing to consider. But this idea of being tempted to foreign goods really rids the Japanese value and personality and intrinsic motivation to create these products and develop the tea ceremony, saying it was all outside this temptation. The Japanese really desired after these things. So the idea of being a reinterpretation of foreign wares, they weren't personally Japanese products. They were just reinterpretations, and it just seems like maybe a term that doesn't necessarily cover the scope of what was really taking place, and that it was a development and a culture within itself. It also misses this Korean aspect, which comes into the article by Koo Tae-hoon, which is the idea of kidnapping or abducting the Korean potters. And she, in this article, Shopping for Pots, doesn't mention or really glosses over this idea of there might have been other, even like from within Japan, pottery and ceramics production, and even the tea practice coming birthed up from Japan, and not just like, oh, we want something that another country has. So also she emphasizes commerce over controversy. So it's like, what really is the cause of all these things? So thinking about this, although she does a wonderful job, of course, of bringing in this new perspective, which is not necessarily an exact interpretation, but the idea of putting yourself in these people's shoes, shopping in this area, what are you seeing? How much are these things costing? Where are they coming from? That just puts a new flavor. It makes us think about things differently, and not just seeing it from a romanticized perspective, but almost like, what was it like to be in that situation? And we can only wonder, we can only imagine and be creative in ourselves. But it's very interesting to be able to think about things that way. And as we have one more perspective on, okay, this heavy emphasis on commerce and international trade as being the motivating factor behind Japanese ceramics, Chanoyu practice, and that kind of thing, we kind of put all these things together and start to wonder, okay, there's a lot of things that come into play when it comes into the East Asian ceramics. And although there were influences on Japan also had their own intrinsic motivations and value, and whether it's religious or practical, otherwise, there was a personality to these things. So I hope you'll read the article and put yourself in those shoes of a shopper and think about things a little bit differently. And I encourage you to go read the article and see those pictures that are on there of those actual products, a lot of things that were excavated. So yes, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.